I mean, some people describe this as being the most comforting section of the whole of the book of Revelation. There's this moment of heightened drama in this catastrophic judgment that comes. It's almost like there's a pause and John's attention is drawn to something else. The whole point here is of assurance that actually, even when the mountains are shaking and the earth is quaking, that there is this security that God has sealed us. And I think that's more than just simply saying we belong. It fundamentally says that we belong, but it also says that the very character of God is imprinted on our beings.
Welcome to this week's Calling a City to Life, a city that now has 2 more car parking spaces than it did this time last week. Brodie, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you, Richard.
And are you utilising those extra car parking spaces? Are you like, it's like when you've got extra seats and you just go and you sit in one, it's like Goldilocks. Like, is one of them particularly close to the house? Is one of them nicer? One of them easier to reverse into?
I still can't get parked outside the house. I'm tempted to kind of like holding parking lessons for everybody in the street of, look, you can actually go quite close to each other and we can fit more cars in. But that community exercise maybe is best in the spring when the weather's better.
Do you think you'd reflect God's grace in doing that adequately?
I think so. I'm more worried whether my neighbours would reflect God's grace or kind of like tie me to a lamppost and stone me or something.
Yeah, I think that's probably a likely outcome. Anyway, Halloween's coming and Guy Fawkes night and stuff, Jack, how are you? How's next door?
I'm grateful that I don't have to worry about fighting over car parking spaces in my day-to-day life.
It's the one thing we do not need to worry about on a farm is lack of car parking spaces. Iain, how's your car parking situation?
Oh, don't get me started.
Oh, no, it's 2 of you, is there? All right, okay.
Yeah, I'll not go any further than that.
Talking about,
I'll just leave it at that.
We're talking about the tribulation of Christians, and it turns out the main tribulation of Christians in the Western world, in the first world, is car parking spaces. Who knew? Who knew indeed? Anyway, Iain, we had you this weekend, fully recovered from your jet lag, preaching to us on Revelation chapter 6 and a wee smidgen of chapter 7. I kind of regret always asking this question now, especially now that we're in Revelation. But, going to knock us up a 60-second summary of what you spoke about?
I know. I think you always feel completely inadequate when you're trying to kind of cover a chapter and a half or whatever of Revelation. You feel you just scrape something on the surface. But I think what I was trying to get across was that trials and tribulations, whether of the vehicular nature or not, are part of life, and that Christians need to expect that that's the climate that we live in. So faith in Jesus is not an exemption from tribulation. So be brave and know that you are sealed in the Holy Spirit and therefore secure in a world of conflict and hostility, and believe that prayer is God's agent for us to engage in seeing change in history around us. So I think that's it.
That's a pretty good summary. So chapter 6 in Revelation is where I begin to feel unraveled, as it were. Like the first 5 chapters, I'm kind of like, okay, I'm with you. And it gets to chapter 6 and I'm like, okay. And there's some things I'm not sure whether I need to be concerned about them or not, because whether or not I understand them correctly, as long as I get the main point, then it's fine. But one of my examples of my questions would be the riders and their horses. Does the horse represent the sin and the rider is, I can't even find the right word now, the rider is Jesus and is therefore conquering it and is demonstrating? No. Brodie's shaking his head saying absolutely not. He's not even going to get, so both are part of the same thing.
So I think I think we can get straight in there, Jackie. Most people, this is the chapter when they bail out of Revelation.
So glad it's not just me.
It's quite normal. But I think what this chapter really is trying to say is, don't panic. don't worry.
But instead, we're all panicking.
Yeah, I think we get the wrong end of the stick. And so, and also don't overanalyze the detail. Now, I know you're a horse lover, and this is not a passage which is attacking
don't worry,
horses
I don't
in any
take it
kind
personally.
of way. No, but rather it is indicating that, you know, we live under the effects of certain influences in our society, and it's not just something that is the kind of harbinger of the end. These are signs of the times in which we all live in, you know, including John on Patmos. He was subject to those same patterns. So I think ultimately it's really important that we remember Revelation is a vision. So what John is seeing is a picture, and the picture doesn't necessarily tie in very specifically with something other than a kind of theological theme or a spiritual component that is evident in our world. So I think it's just really saying, don't worry, God understands that war, conflict, violence, injustice, and death are present in our world. So don't get shocked by that, but instead know that, maybe we'll jump into other things now, but knowing that you are secure because you're sealed in the Spirit. So don't panic, and believe and know that prayer actually is effective in that kind of climate.
It's interesting for you to say that, because I think that sometimes there are places where we miss things because there is more being revealed in a passage than we're actually taking out of it. And what you're essentially saying is that you don't need to get hung up on some of the smaller details, because they're not contributing to our great theological understanding of what is trying to be communicated to us.
I'm sure there is value in the detail, but I think we kind of sometimes read Revelation from some kind of very intricate, granular determination of what a particular thing means, rather than getting the big picture. And, you know, I think sometimes you see the forest before you see the trees. And I think once you see the forest, then it helps you to see what the trees might be, rather than actually then, you know, kind of building up the other way and then saying, well, what is this horse? And, you know, who might represent this horse and who might represent this particular image. So I think Revelation is trying to give us an overview of what's happening, but also trying to give us an inside view of what God is doing in the midst of what we see.
Yeah, think of it like one of those big kind of like masterpiece kind of paintings that you'd see in the National Gallery of. Very often they're blurry if you stand too close. You've actually got to step back to see the picture. But the picture's made up of those details, those fine brush strokes. And so it's helpful to kind of like stand back and think, what's the overarching theme here? What's the overarching message? So in chapter 6 and following, one of the overarching things is actually restraint, rather than kind of like the consequences we see of what these horses and their riders do. And I think as well of, you know, in the ancient world, horses spoke of power. So it's communicating something about powers, and that there's a rider on it, that this is, and again, we can't tease it out too kind of like definitively of that these powers and human beings together are acting here. That they are collaborating or, you know, cooperating. So we don't, you know, in one sense, we are the rider of the horses, or the world is the rider of the horses. Iain used the phrase on Sunday, what horse are you riding of? And that's a really good question to ask, because we are cooperative, complicit. The good news of the gospel is that we know freedom from those powers. We still live with them, but we know a different Lord, and that's part of the good news of there are these powers, but we can know freedom from them.
Okay, so I'm going to try and avoid getting specific in that case, but I'm going to fail miserably. So 4 horses. So if we just roll it back a little bit to end of chapter 5. So the end of chapter 5, it's been identified that there's only one who's worthy to open the seals to break these seals, these 7 seals. And that is the Lion of Judah, who appears as a lamb, and we discussed that a bit last week. And the first seal is released, and if I guess what I'm trying to get at is an answer to the question of, is what's being released intrinsically evil causing? It's a release this out to the world to do, or is it releasing judgment on what is already there? Like in the first horse, it's about being given. I think the phrase is, blah, 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 when it had a bow and a crown was given to him. In the second seal, it was granted permission to take peace. There's a bit of kind of Job type language of God granting this bad stuff to happen. Is there any significance? Is there anything we should be reading into that, or is that me going for the minutiae?
Yeah, and I want to say a couple of things in response to that, Richard. I think the first thing is that what is being opened is revelation in the first instance.
Okay.
So the seal that gets broken discloses what's going on. So it's not necessarily the seal is the mechanism that then creates the power or releases the power. So it just reveals rather than releases it. But there is a sense also in which these expressed as human powers, and human powers that are permitted under the overall authority of God, because we know that God ultimately will come to the final seal and will have the final word. So there's a permissiveness in the plan of God that allows humanity to follow humanity's disoriented and dysfunctional and evil intent. But that intent actually itself becomes judgment. So when we think later on about the judgment that comes, the judgment is not, even in seal number 6, it's not necessarily that God is intervening. God intervenes in seal 7, which we didn't really kind of get to, but the seal number 6 is the consequence of these human powers being manifest. So there's a sense in which what is judgment? Judgment is God giving you what you really want and allowing you to do what you really want to do. But actually, humanity doing what we really want to do is destructive and self-destructive. So that's why I think to some extent we get this idea that the riders are human riders, that the power comes from humanity and the consequence is a consequence for humanity as well. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Brodie, if I put that in the right way.
Yep, no, I think that's what this is saying. It's a bit like, now, we are parents. Not everybody listening to the podcast may be parents, but as parents certainly had the situation of your child gets a big bar of chocolate and you say, if you eat all that in the one go as you are, you're going to be sick. And in some respects, that's what's happening here, of God is allowing the consequences of these actions, of these powers at work. And what this revelation aspect of it is saying is, listen, you guys are living under empire and whatnot. You know that it's bad, but here's how this works. Here's we're disclosing to you, or the power behind this, that it's not benign. This is where it leads. These are the consequences of it. So God has lessened or his restraint of these powers, that these powers then take effect to their inverted commas natural consequence, or their end point. This is what these powers do.
I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, Iain, about that this is a book that's already contains all of this, that is just being opened, and it's a revelation rather than necessarily a sequence of events. It's a kind of, to pull in some popular filmography, seeing as we're cinema-buffs, the kind of everything everywhere all at once is, yes, we have to read things in an order in which they're written, but actually This is about opening a book that is revealing everything that's going on. And yes, some of it is going on more here and more there and more, but fundamentally it's just the revelation, the tableau, the laying out of everything that's going on. And that, as you're going to say later, that fundamentally God is in control of it all. Jack?
I was just going to say that I found both Ian and Brodie's comments there really helpful, because going back to my original thing when I was talking about the rider having the horse in submission, and this is my only horsey geeky thing for today, is that...
It really isn't. It really won't be. It would be. I know you've got a question about one of the horses.
Carrying on, is that... so if when at the Olympics, when someone's doing a dressage test, that you get marks for obedience in relation to the horse, because the rider is getting the horse to do what the horse is doing, and it's to do with how obedient it is. But your point being that we as humans with free will are taking, directing, orchestrating where all of our sin and misery is going, because we're making the choices.
I think as well, I mean, the way that, so going back to week one, Ian kind of like said, this isn't a narrative that just has a simple flow to it. It's not chronological in that respect. So we are in the end times or end days as much as John's first hearers of this were, and that this is what is unfolding constantly throughout human history. But there is an aspect of it as well, and we see this of John kind of like, or the same themes are repeated but with different pictures to build in different layers and colours to it. And when we get further on and there is the Whore of Babylon, there's a sense in which, yes, she is participating in this evil, but there's also a sense in which she is trapped by it. And again, we come back to the good news in this is we have been freed from this. We can see that this is wrong and therefore reject it. We still have to live in the midst of it and with the effects of it. So you get the whole thing about people washing their clothes in the blood. I mean, there's a paradox for you. Wash your clothes in something red and it comes out white. So there is that revealing of you can be free from coming under this power. We still have to live with its effects and its consequences, but there's a freedom that we can have from it because we now know what this power is and that it's anti-God, and we choose to be on God's side.
Okay, so let's move this on a little bit. Ian, you kind of split the first part of chapter 6 into sort of 3 sections. You started off with one of my favourite Scottish colloquialisms, the kind of who's like us, no one, and they're all dead type thing.
Yeah.
Lead us through the 3 sections. You had the kind of present reality from 1 to 8. What was your? I mean, my main takeaway from that was you were defining what these horses mean and trying to show us where arrogance or militarism or economic injustice might appear in our area of life.
Yeah, I think just trying to see these as the kind of themes that affect us and infect us. I think we just really took a bit of time or didn't take very much time at all, just to try and pinpoint some of those things. I think some people would suggest that there's a kind of flow almost in these 4 characteristics that if you think of the first horse and the idea of the rider being crowned or taking a crown upon themselves, that whole idea of taking sovereignty and taking self-sovereignty. So that one of the commentators had suggested that's not just about our individual sovereignty, but it's also how we as ethnic groups, as nation states, we all have some expression of, yeah, everybody's equal, but we're just a little bit better than the others.
Exceptionalism, yeah.
Exceptionalism is the kind of expression that we would use for that, and we all have that, but we tend to be quite blindsided to it. So I think that's worth kind of calling out that we get infected by that as well. And then it kind of runs through the other themes, and basically where we perceive ourselves to be different or to have a different purpose or will, that can often manifest in conflict, and conflict can end up in violence and militarism. And then we looked at the kind of injustice, which is expressed by the set of scales, and then the four of the horses or the riders on the horses kind of manifest the consequence of injustice and of arrogance and of violence, which is death. So there is a bit of a sequence through that. And then we get into quite a different perspective, which is this perspective of, well, where are God's people in the midst of all of this? So this is what's thundering around the world. Where are God's people? And here the vision is really of those who have been perhaps most deeply affected by the consequences of the world. So the people who have faced persecution, people who've been violently attacked because of their faith. And John has a vision of these people in that secure place under the altar of God, but also just being they're really conscious of what has happened to them. So we kind of looked a little bit about how we respond to persecution or to being offended or attacked. And, I can refer to the fact that we generally, or me personally, tend to get into a mode of complaint and avenge. And vengeance tends to be the kind of place that kind of pollutes our hearts. But here we have this expression of desire for restitution, really, which sounds pretty brutal, but actually when you look at the context, this is a cry for justice, where the saints or the martyrs under the altars say, "How long, sovereign Lord, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" So I don't know if you want to come back to me that Richard, what you were thinking about.
I mean, yes, for the first bit, moving on to the second part about the fifth seal and the martyrs, I felt one of the interesting phrases there, and I don't know if it's just my translation or if it's a more generally thing, is when the instruction is given, like the complaint is made, which is represented as being a holy complaint, when when does everybody else get their comeuppance? This has happened to us, we've been persecuted, when does this all sort itself out? You're the God of the universe. And rather than it being a weight, it's a rest. And I don't know whether there was a significance in it not just being a wait for a while, this will all sort itself out, but a more direct, almost like calm down, like not just a stay where you are, but almost like a relax. It's all taken care of, much more of a kind of embrace, if you like, from God. Kind of, the chicken gathering its chicks type of thing, of it's okay, come and rest, as opposed to just, hold your horses, pardon the pun, in the light of all of this, and just wait a while. I don't know if there's any particular significance in that. Is there anything you want to speak into in that?
Well, I think they're told that the waiting is until the number of their fellow servants and brothers who were to be killed was completed. So there's a sense in which, again, the communication to them is that despite what they're sensing and experiencing, there is a conclusion to all of this, which is in the sovereign purposes of God, that actually there will be an end, but God is overseeing that process. So they are to wait until a specific point which God has under his jurisdiction. So I think it's more wait, but wait knowing that this outcome is going to be reached, that there is a purpose which will not be thwarted, and that God is in command, if you like, of the whole narrative.
Interestingly, Richard, you'll like this, because here's a bit of Greek. Well, it's actually what's missing from the Greek. The word number is missing from the Greek when it talks about being complete. And one commentator puts it this way, kind of like crudely in some respects. What is being spoken of here is not kind of like some heavenly martyr quota that needs to be completed, but until their witness has been completed, until what God has given them to do is completed and God's work within them is completed. And that strikes with, one of the big themes right through Revelation is be faithful, and be faithful until the end. Complete the race that you've been given. Stay on course. Don't get blown off course. Don't panic, Corporal Jones, don't panic, and then run in and create more trouble for yourself. So there is in one sense that kind of like calm down element to it. But what is completed here is not a number of people killed or martyred, but what is completed here is God's work and our witness.
That's so interesting, because I assume that I'm not a martyr because I'm not being persecuted for preaching the good news. I'm not going to go to prison for going to church on Sunday. And so I don't include myself within that. So I feel like that's quite a separate section for people who aren't me. No,
because I think at this time, the word martyr is not most commonly being used to describe somebody who's died for their beliefs or their faith. The word martyr is most commonly being used to describe somebody who is a witness. So first and foremost, when we read martyr, read witness. And on occasion, that refers to somebody who has died for their faith. So we are all martyrs. We are all witnesses. And not all of us are called to lay down our life. Well, we are called to lay down our life in one sense, but
yes,
to be actually suffer physical violence, etc. So Revelation applies to all of us, not just a select few.
Yeah, and maybe just to get back to Richard's original question about
can anyone remember what it was?
Well, it was about what's happening are they being encouraged to just hang on or to rest? It's not because I have memorized the Greek text, but just because I've just looked it up. And the word that's used in verse 11, which is translated rest, probably most translations, literally, or the translation is of a word, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, but it has the prefix ana, which is about repeating or returning. So it means something like ceasing from movement or labor in order to recover and collect strength.
Interesting.
So it's actually, which is really interesting, isn't it? If you think about what is God saying to those who are under the cosh, who are seeking to be witnesses, it's that there is a place not just of hanging on, but a place of healing and recovery for those who have been damaged and who are needing to know some sort of healing and repair from the injuries of being persecuted or of this hostile world. So yeah, I think that's really
cool.
That's one that didn't come out in the sermon, but it's one just to kind of look into. So good.
Only took me 26 episodes to ask a good question, but there we go. So the final, not the final section, but the final part of, if you like, your initial 3-point before you got into the 3 Ps later on. Shout out to Edwin, was to do with the kind of what happens next with Seal 7. This is headlined in my Bible as terror. You want to unpack the terrible verses 12 to 17 for us, Iain?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is actually Seal 6. Just saying.
It is. Seal 6. Seal 6.
So
Sorry.
I think here's a shout out for all Christians. The terror is not the end. The trouble is not the end. The end is actually much more exciting, much more positive than that. Yeah, I mean, I think what you have here is the language of the great day of the Lord. There's a lot of Old Testament, a reference, an allusion in Revelation, and what we have here is the kind of language that's used quite a lot at the end of the Old Testament to describe in the prophets the end days. So you have this kind of cataclysmic series of events, or perhaps events is not the right word. It's actually a series of images that John has in his mind, or is given. Earthquake, sun turning black, whole moon turning red, and the stars in the sky falling to earth. So this is a signaling judgment. And I think, as we alluded to earlier on, it's a judgment that is kind of embedded already in humanity, that when we ride out with injustice and hostility and arrogance and narcissism, then there is an inherent judgment in that. There's a consequence for those actions. And certainly a number of the commentators would reflect that this isn't so much a judgment of God, where God is intervening. This is a consequence of human sin that's being expressed.
I really liked, this is actually going back to your section 2, so I'm sorry, this is a slight reverse, but I think it references as well in this section, is just that you talked about the fact that the living creatures are asking Jesus to come, and as part of that, it's, the how long, Lord, until you're intervening, and you reference the other places in Revelation as well, where it's talking about, look, he is coming, and yeah. I found that quite helpful, because I found the sort of come references all quite confusing in the way in which they were. I didn't know to whom and to which way, and the directional part of that.
You and many commentators.
Okay, that's so helpful.
So lots of people don't know who's being called here, and I think there are different views. So some people do see this as a reference to the powers, the horses, and the riders being called into action. And maybe this is a minority view that I have, but I just found it very interesting that when you begin to think about this language of invitation, it's pretty much, your kingdom come, your will be done. And actually the announcement of that plea and that invitation that sort of precedes the revelation of the horsemen of the apocalypse. The commentators on this passage would say, well, what's really being called here? Who is being invited? And given that it's the living creatures rather than the kind of human beings, that has that reference to calling Christ to be present in the midst of the conflict, which kind of then resonates with the believers under the throne who are also calling for God to act. So, there would be this idea that there's a repetition of this invitation for God to act in the midst of history and then in the midst of persecution.
Staying with the believers under the throne just for a second, of the answer to their question is not just rest, but it repeats what Jesus promised to the church in Sardis, of, if you remember in the church in Sardis, of they were promised white robes because they are victorious and they overcome. So they're both told to wait or rest and given white robes. So it's not just a sit there and twiddle your thumbs, but you are the ones who are victorious. So there is a consolation within, or a comfort within that, that even while they're in the midst of this, that they're already pronounced victorious.
I found you finished up, obviously, in chapter 7, you covered verses 1 to 4, and you talked about God speaking over us, that he or she belongs to me, and that his salvation is sufficient for us. I found that quite moving on Sunday. It reminded me of the song, His Banner Over Me Is Love, that we used to sing when I was tiny, and this suggestion of feeling so marked by him, that the seal of God on the foreheads of his servants. Sections like these carry so much power in them for us, and I think it's so easy to focus on the parts that feel overwhelming, and to not linger longer in the places where there's so much comfort and so much power for us.
I mean, some people describe this as being the most comforting section of the whole of the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
And again, it speaks this whole thing of how chronological really is this whole thing, because we've got to seal 6, there will be a seal 7. And people can go and look up what seal 7 is and find that and text us with the answer. But But Seal 6, where there's this moment of heightened drama in this catastrophic judgment that comes, it's almost like there's a pause and John's attention is drawn to something else. I mean, it's there in verse 17. Who on earth can stand in the midst of this? That, and then chapter 7 sort of answers that question. Who on earth can stand? Well, anybody who has been marked with the seal of the Lamb can stand. And that's, almost a kind of complete reversal of how people normally read and perceive Revelation. That Revelation is a way of scaring the horses or scaring the church, that it's actually, it becomes very fearful. But the whole point here is of assurance that actually, even when the mountains are shaking and the earth is quaking, that there is this security that God has sealed us. And it comes again in chapter 14, where again we get the 144,000. And there in 14:1, we're told that they have on their foreheads the name of the Lamb and the name of the Lamb's Father. So we basically have God's imprint on us. And I think that's more than just simply saying we belong. It fundamentally says that we belong, but it also says that the very character of God is imprinted on our beings, and that we are not like the culture that produces judgment, but we have been recreated in Christ Jesus and bear his characteristics and his mark. So it is actually quite a strong theme in the whole of what's revealed. The
fullness of our salvation feels so evident in those verses in chapter 7. It feels like it brings an extra layer to how we understand so much of the New Testament. It feels like, for me anyway.
Yeah, I don't mean to demean all the great interpretation, but am I the only one that when they reads this thinks of ice cream? Because you get to the word interlude, and all I can think of is old-fashioned cinemas where you'd have an interlude, like you'd have all this action happening on the screen, and then in order to change the film, they'd have to stop it, and then somebody would wander down the aisle with ice cream at the front, and you go back, and then the action movie would start again after the interlude. It's the most peculiar word that the editors or the people who put the actual translations together have used to introduce these like 3 verses in chapter 7. Is it just my Bible that says interlude as a chapter heading?
It's not in mine.
Doesn't say in mine, Richard.
Okay.
I think it's getting your Bible.
It must have been this dodgy American translation. Darn them.
I mean, you're just explaining it all, really, aren't you?
So, to the American listeners, I like the idea that you use interlude. It just brings out for me that it just kind of is like the action stops.
Yeah.
Like, it's all kicking off, and then it just goes bang, and then you're kind of in this little tranquil moment of, don't worry, be all right, don't panic. As you say from the beginning, don't panic, and then it all kicks off again.
Yeah, but I mean, it's about what the intention of the book is. So the intention of the book is to galvanize Christians throughout the ages to know that they are sealed and secure in Christ, know that they have an impact upon the world, and they have a glorious future ahead of them. So it's actually maybe not an interlude, but it's maybe let's just check in here and remind you of what the real picture is, because we've taken you through all of this challenge and destruction and fear. And hey, get the point here. Actually, let's step back, remind ourselves that we are sealed in Christ. And it speaks this whole thing again that Revelation is just not a chronology one after the other. It's a release of a revelation.
It's more like one of those box sets rather than a film where they give you the kind of previously, on last week's episode, this is what happened, but we're moving on. It's like a reminder.
It's a bit of a sidebar. It's the don't panic sidebar.
Yeah,
this is the reality.
Cool.
Richard, this feels like a good point for a listener's question.
It does, because we're at the end of where Iain preached up to which was chapter 7, verse 3, and the headline for the next part is the 144,000. And we were collared at the end of the service going to ask about the 144,000. Now, I don't know whether we're jumping the gun here, if someone's going to take up the mantle of this next week, or if you're going to handily jump straight to chapter 8 and miss it out. This person was clearly concerned, A, who are the 144,000, and B, are they one of them?
So I'm happy to have a stab at answering that. So here is God assembling an army of the saints. And there's a couple of really peculiar things, but if we know how God works, we're not surprised. 144,000, do you know what? That's a tiny, minuscule army. And yet we see that that's how God has worked in the past. So it's a symbolic number. But then what follows this 144,000 is, after this I looked and I saw there was a great multitude that no one can count. So again, it's symbolic of the full inclusion of God's people, and that God doesn't work through a mass of numbers or strength, but works through weakness. And there is this great multitude from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, who stand before the throne, robed in white, so are classed as conquerors. So that would be my take on the 144,000, that it's not, we don't need to do, am I one of them, am I related to one of them, and all that sort of stuff. It's not a limit on who God extends his grace to or who enjoys his salvation.
So we need not be concerned.
Don't think so.
Thank you, Brodie.
Maybe just a couple of things to add to that, if I may. I think it is the kind of the numeric multiplication of the tribes of Israel. And it's not actually exactly the tribes of, he lists things in a different way in Revelation, but therefore we know it is symbolic. So I think because it's a specific number, it references the history of God's people, Israel. So you're kind of, that's been called out. I think the other thing that's been called out is the idea of completeness. So everybody who is saved is complete in that number. So you've got a complete number. Then you have a numberless number, specific number, countless number. So I think you're getting two things being said. One is that the number will be accurate. God will know the hair of everybody's head, that he's specific and granular in his care. But at the same time, his grace is expansive and wide. And so we can trust that God knows us personally and specifically, but that also God's invitation and God's grace is measureless. So I think it's conveying at least those two things.
Cool. Sounds all right to me. So if you're not a member of one, if you're not numbered in one, you're definitely numbered in the other. So the questioner has nothing to worry about.
I think they're numbered in both.
Numbered in both. Even better. Well, we're kind of coming to a bit of a close. I guess I am keen for some cultural recommendations. I'm really keen to know if Brodie enjoyed the end of Ashoka from last week, if he's caught up in his Star Wars from last time.
Yes.
Why don't you give us a final thought and a cultural recommendation? Can be a podcast, a bit of music, a book, all at the same time. So Brodie, why don't you go first? So final thoughts on Revelation 6 and 7, what Iain preached. I don't think we can land at a more perfect place than where Iain did with that cry, "Come, Maranatha, come your kingdom, come Lord Jesus." I think that's just where we need to land with all of this. With regards to culture, so you were asking about music and what music we're enjoying just now. So Richard, you will like this. I am really enjoying
Larnell Lewis, who is he was the drummer in Snark Puppy, but has done some stuff on his own. So, in particular, really liking his song City Lights.
Good stuff.
So, if you've not listened to it, Richard, as a drummer, I would recommend that you listen to it.
I will go and listen to my Snarkiest Puppy as soon as we have finished recording.
No, this isn't with Snark Puppy. This is a different band. This is him on his own.
Okay. Jack, give us your thoughts to summarise, and a wee cultural reference to boot.
I mean, I don't feel I'm that cultural, so this feels like a bit of a not very good example of someone being very cultural. However, the new Gas Street music album is out, called Woven, live from the Coal House. It's been out for a few weeks now, beginning of September, I think it came out. And the more I listen to it, the more I enjoy it. So would highly recommend. And my other final thought is I'm sort of feeling a little guilty this week that I have the privilege of speaking to these two wondrous men who are illuminating scripture. Sorry,
surely
I mean, well, I'm not asking you. I can't win. I feel like I should just stop now. The privilege of being able to ask these questions, like Richard and I are doing the kind of Revelation for Dummies bit by being as by being as bold about our misunderstandings as we can, and the privilege of getting all the helpful answers. It feels super helpful to me, and I'm grateful for the chance. So I would definitely encourage others to ask their questions.
Good stuff. And Iain, you preached it, so give us your final thoughts now. And a wee cultural reference to the side.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think, gosh, there are just so many horrendous things going on in our world. And it does feel as if the horsemen of the apocalypse are treading fiercely over the Middle East at the moment. And so I just kind of want to really reference that prayer, and I think just of "Come Lord Jesus," as Brodie said, and it just really struck me as I was preparing this, and really kind of went back to that the way that cry was interwoven into the noise of the hooves, and I think just for all of us not knowing how to pray, there's a kind of confidence that this gives us, and just praying, "Come Lord Jesus," and also hearing the Lord saying to us, "Look, I am coming quickly." So that's kind of where I want to leave it. Cultural reference. Well, I thought maybe some music to listen or to read Revelation to. So I asked Chris McClarney.
Oh, always good.
And from his album Love Never Fails, it's been around for a while. And he sings a brilliant version of Bob Dylan's "When He Returns." So I recommend that to encourage you as you read Revelation.
I endorse that.
As endorsed by Jackie.
Yep. Chris McClarney, always win. One of his best albums.
So yeah, that's great. I think I'll just go away and reread Black Beauty and watch Warhorse and just get all my horse input for the week. But other than that, do send us in your thoughts, your own revelations on Revelation. Email office@qpbc.org. We do have a book that is available for somebody to win. We have a comment. We have a written comment, a written review of the podcast.
Oh, he's died again. Okay, you're back.
We have a written review of the podcast, so if you would like to leave yours, then when we get to a suitable number, we'll have a wee prize draw for a book that Iain has recommended that I accidentally bought two of. So do leave us a review, written review, not just a star rating. Say something nice, ideally, or give us your thoughts, and let us know all about that. But other than that, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to Brodie next week, Iain next week, 144,000.
No, we have a guest speaker next week. So let's keep that under wraps and introduce her to the podcast next week.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
Good stuff. We'll see you all again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.